It's 2 minutes after the top of the hour, and so we're going to go ahead and kick off. So, two things to start. First, I want to apologize for the confusion with last week's schedule and kicking it to this week. And so that is entirely with me. And like I said, sometimes you get what you pay for, and I don't get paid. And so but just by way of explanation, we have scheduled these to be the second Tuesday of every month. And last week, it was the 8th, and so not normally the second Tuesday, but it was. And so we just had some scheduling confusion inside the province, for which I am solely responsible. And so I just want to apologize for any inconvenience, and then thank everybody for showing up again today. So thank you for that. And we are blessed to have Dr. Curtin with us again, and to have this time together. So if you would just indulge me for a short prayer, and then I will talk it over, ask Dr. Curtin to take it over. So in the name of the Father, and the Son, and Holy Spirit. Dear God, thank you so much for this time together as a community of Augustinians. And we pray that this time may help us to better understand the past of the order so that we can better understand the future of the order, and that we can also discern your will for us in enabling that future. We especially thank Dr. Curtin for his time, not only now, but in all the hours of preparation before now. And we pray for everybody on this Zoom call and all of our intentions through you, Lord. And Blessed Mother, we ask for your prayers and intercession on all of our behalf as well. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Thank you, everybody. And Dr. Curtin, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Jim. Good evening. So I'm trying to remember, this is the third session of the history of the Order of St. Augustine and of Augustinianism. Tonight I really wanted to be able to delve into how the Augustinian Order proper was formed and its context, as well as questions surrounding it like the ideas of mendicantism, medieval church reform, and the papacy. All of these elements surround the formation of the order as a formal entity, but aren't discussed in much depth in church circles, as it can be a little dizzying to sort through. So hopefully this series is helpful in presenting a clear and relatively chronological way of being able to go through this. Last month, we talked about this period between the death of Augustine and the early spread of Augustinian ideas and what we know as the Gregorian Reformation. To briefly review this, the Augustinian thought was heavily spread around Western Europe by the Franks, who standardized a number of things in their monasteries in the realm, and also gave patronage to the foundations of European schools, all on the Augustinian model. This went on until the 11th century, when the papacy sought to fix some issues of corruption within the church, namely the Latin clergy, where discipline had become lax, and there were recurring problems that caused frustration with the general population. Prior to the Gregorian Reformation, clergymen famously had wives, sometimes multiple wives, and attempted to pass down church property to their sons. Just the same with local bishops, who sometimes held the title generation to generation. In response to this, lay people initially formed communities in the hopes of returning to a simple, what is sometimes called apostolic Christianity, some of which were groups like those which were discussed in northern Tuscany, who formed small communities in the woods and the mountains, removed from the growing urban centers of Italy. These are the groups that will lay the foundation for the Augustinian Order, which we will be able to focus in on shortly. But before we do, it's really necessary to speak specifically about this new thing that's developing around the time of the formation of the order, and that is the birth of mendicantism, which takes place at this period. The term mendicant, like most of our church terms, is derived from Latin mendicans, meaning beggars. Following the Gregorian Reformation, we see the growth of these movements, particularly in the 12th century, as European cities begin to develop in such a way that the structure of the church appears unprepared for. Mendicants generally take vows of poverty. They travel into different regions preaching, particularly among the poor. This is a movement that's very much interested in the rejection of the wealth and the power that has been incorporated into the medieval church and attempting to rediscover a purer Christianity. All of these movements which come about that are classified as mendicant might be called grassroots. There's no official founding by a bishop or a pope. Mendicant movements more or less emerge organically, each with a different emphasis, and eventually are incorporated into the broader church. Prior to this point, the church had various institutions that more or less populated the landscape of France and Italy and Germany, but they're heavy, static places. Monasteries are fixed in rural environs and are generally disconnected from growing urban life because that's how they're intended to function. They're supposed to be removed from the world. What's more, medieval monasteries became heavily attached to the politics of their respective regions. So famously, to be a monk in some of the great abbeys in France required an endowment and, in a lot of cases, the right familial connections. If you look at the family tree of the early kings of France, the Capetians, you do see the king himself, but he's related to a lot of abbots and prioresses. That's to be expected because that's a very powerful political office. Mendicantism wanted to be able to turn this on its head. It sought to reach out specifically to the poor, to offer comfort and care to the growing mass of displaced people who are entering into Western Europe's major city centers. And they were generally detached from the broader political apparatus of medieval Europe. There's also a tremendous emphasis placed on preaching in mendicantism. In a society that was largely illiterate, this was important. Priests did provide sermons historically, but because of the liturgical, the linguistic shift of Western Europe, high ecclesiastical Latin was not commonly understood. So you would have these itinerant preachers who were able to speak to the poor in a plain and vernacular language. And some mendicant orders, like the Dominicans, are famous for embracing this, so much so that their official name is the Order of Preachers. One of the more commonly reiterated ideas of mendicantism was apostolic poverty. And this is born straight out of Acts of the Apostles, where people read about the early church, that it was mobile and the apostles themselves were constantly traveling. The accounts of the lives of Saints Peter and Paul and Barnabas and John portray them as owning nothing and being possessed by nothing, saving only the gospel. Mendicantism was an attempt to try to recreate the early spirit of the church through this kind of voluntary evangelical movement, embracing a life of material simplicity, mimicking the life of Christ to facilitate total service to God and to the poor. It's really difficult to say exactly how this started. The earliest groups that still survive that embrace this as the Order of the Brothers of the Blessed Virgin Mary of Mount Carmel, better known today as the Carmelites, who were founded in the Holy Land sometime in the middle of the 12th century, although no one's quite sure. As you can imagine, the birth of this movement was met with some trepidation. While some early mendicant orders come down to us today and are still familiar to us, at the time, these were very unorganized and ultimately unauthorized preachers, which made local bishops very nervous. Effectively, you had a large number of illiterate peasants going around preaching with little to no theological education. while the medieval church didn't really want to quash the enthusiasm of these groups, they were also deeply worried about the impact that they might have. And this would come to a head in someone like Peter Waldo, who was probably mostly forgotten to us today. He's a French friar of the 12th century, and he would seem otherwise identical to most mendicant groups, only that he refused to submit to any authority, to the local bishops, and in fact began preaching against the bishops, against the papacy, against the efficacy of the sacraments, which caused social chaos both in his own native Lyon, but also in northern Italy, where the movement gained a lot of traction. He would be kind of the heretical direction that mendicant movements were heading that had to be directed by the church. His gargoyle still exists in the edifice of Lyon Cathedral to this day, with his head hollow and his face, he's facing backwards towards the sky. The church of the early 13th century saw Waldo and what he was saying and wanted to be able to standardize and control the mendicant movement so that it would not spin out of control, such as with Waldo and the Waldensians, as his followers were become known. While there were mendicant movements in the 12th century, the Latin Church found a model for the movement in the person of St. Francis. He's someone that really doesn't require much exposition. Everyone knows St. Francis, perhaps one of the most familiar Catholic saints there is. Born Giovanni Pietro di Bernardoni, Francis was famously not a clergyman, although there are some accounts that he may have been a deacon. That's not totally clear. Francis is a mendicant. He's begging on the streets of Italian cities. He's assuming the rough brown robes of the poor, and in his words, preaching the gospel with his deeds. And Francis truly typifies this movement. He becomes the model from what all subsequent mendicant orders are structured. And the Franciscans would be given their papal blessing in 1209 as the Friars Minor under Pope Innocent III. The Pope wanted to enter a way of being able to curb some of the excesses of mendicantism without blocking the enthusiasm of it by bringing them into the structure of the church. And so you see this repeated again with St. Dominic and his order of preachers, who were brought in likewise in 1216, along with a bunch of smaller groups like the Red Friars, the Mercedarians, the Servites, and so on, all mendicant groups that obtain their sanction and discipline from the Pope, but with certain conditions attached to ensure that they would be faithful stewards of the church. As a quick note, mendicants are different from monks in various ways, and sometimes these are generally focused. Mendicants, who frequently employ the term friar, which is just a corruption of the French frère, brother, were originally lay people who had no relationship to any kind of holy orders. They had no formal element of the church supporting them, and they were frequently transient, moving from place to place. As a general rule, monks are focused in a singular place, and they're generally uninterested in any kind of evangelism. Their idea is to be able to retreat from the world. They're actively looking to remove themselves from anything that might be considered worldly and not become further entrenched in it. This idea would also come to a head a few centuries later during something like the Counter-Reformation, where you see the Jesuits, who define their charism as being what they called vita activia, the active life, going out there into the world, embracing things, doing things, rather than staying back into the monastery, rather than the older idea of vita contemplatia, the life of contemplation. In order to understand what this means in the Augustinian context, it's worth noting that the Augustinians have no singular historic founder. While Augustine gave the grammar to the Augustinian community, he didn't lay the cornerstone, at least not in the foundation sense of any kind of modern order. Instead, there are several smaller groups that were brought together to form the Augustinian community, each one which has its own independent history and reasons for being. I think we've talked to some degree about the canons regular of St. Augustine, who do claim some sense of continuity from him. But they're not a single organized group. They're usually organized household to household, monastery to monastery. When it comes to mendicantism in particular, one of these first early groups is commonly known as the Williamites. We see them developing similarly like the Tuscan hermits in the same region, starting in about the 12th century. And eventually they form themselves into a religious community. Unfortunately, as a fact of history, we don't know much about their founder, St. William. There was an account of his life that has been lost to us today. These things tend to happen very commonly in medieval history where documents are written and then they just kind of vanish on a shelf somewhere. However, the community which bore his name was very much a model of a mendicant order, focused on things like poverty and prayer and being able to live in communal simplicity. The Williamites themselves, most of them would go on to join the Order of St. Augustine when the order was formally brought together, but some of their houses did remain independent until the 18th century. So those houses which do continue are Augustinian, otherwise they're totally extinct. Another one of these proto-Augustinian groups is known as the Hermits of St. John the Good, also known as the Bonites, bon being the Italian word for good. They would also be forerunners for the Augustinian order. Their namesake John was a court jester, I believe, for the Duke of Milan before he became a friar himself, and was declared blessed in Rome in the 15th century, as he's considered one of the saints of the Augustinian order, despite not being in the Augustinian order proper. John the Good, I believe, also founded another lay organization called the Brothers and Sisters of Penance during his lifetime, which is a little bit more obscure. The Bonites, unlike the Williamites, observed the rule of St. Augustine, where the Williamites had observed their own specific rule. And again, they were interested in the same idea, the employment of the mendicant lifestyle with this Augustinian notion of the idea of common life, trying to bring these things together. This all brings us to the first event in what is recognizably the Augustinian order, what is usually called the Little Union in 1244, which took place in this building up here on the right. Starting in 1243, we have these group of Tuscan hermits who had come together, and they wrote to the papacy expressing the desire to be formed into a single order and thus have some say in the church. So in 1244, the Pope ordered them to adopt the rule of St. Augustine and unite under a common structure. And in doing so, they created what was called the Tuscan Hermits of St. Augustine, with a prior general and a shared constitution, and all of some of the familiar trappings that we would see in the Augustinian order today. This would not quite be the order of St. Augustine that's familiar to us, but it would lay the foundation for what would come a decade later. Also significant, because the papacy is a political institution, they had to have some level of support, usually from cardinals who were able to act as not only a prior general, but also as a potential advocate for the order. And so in doing so, they elected their first prior general in the person of Arnolfo di Cambrio, who is pictured, at least his effigy, down here at the bottom. Following the Little Union, which created this smaller Augustinian entity that was able to consolidate a small local community, we see the papacy looking to be able to expand this. And they expanded it in a significant way. In the issuing of the papal bull, Cum Quaedam Salubria, the Grand Union of 1256. Now, this was a papal act by Pope Alexander IV, who wanted to unify several small Italian communities of hermits who had been living under the rule of St. Augustine or something analogous, also into a singular mendicant religious order, which of course is the Order of St. Augustine. And this is the direct line of continuity that has existed for the last 770 years. So this was promulgated through a papal bull. The union merged some of the small groups that I mentioned. The previously aforementioned group, the Tuscan hermits of St. Augustine, who had been living in northern Italy. Other groups like the hermits of Brentino, the hermits of Montefalvi, the other groups that I mentioned, such as the Williamites and the Bonites, and some of the canons regular of St. Augustine. They were all brought together to form the creation of this new congregation, again under a centralized structure with a prior general, a common constitution, some way of being able to bring some of these groups together to form a common sense of control and unity. Most of this reform was part of the broader 13th century papal effort to organize independent hermit movements into a disciplined group so that they can be given clear identity, but also taught directly about theology and given some sense of discipline for what that's going to look like, especially moving into the future, where mendicant groups and especially friars begin to shape the future of European universities. The Grand Union also marks something significant for the Augustinian order, because originally the Augustinian hermits were a lay organization that contained some clerics, especially the Tuscan hermits, who were interested in retreating from the world. They didn't involve any kind of priestly formation. The Grand Union doesn't demand this. In 1256, there's no requirement to join the Augustinians is to be ordained into the clergy. For the first 50 years after the Union, there begins this push to make sure that its members do become clerical. And lay brothers continue to exist in the order, even to this day, but the majority of friars moving forward become ordained priests. So much so that within 50 years, by about 1300, the majority of the order would become composed mostly of priests. I think in the previous session, somebody wanted to know specifically about the presence of women in the order. And certainly there's a long history of Augustinian canonesses, which continue the history of Augustinianism, but really are not in the order proper. It's probably worth mentioning the Augustinian nuns here, who exist in a very specific space. They're organized and consolidated around the same time of the Order of St. Augustine, again with the Grand Union in 1256, but they're a separate organization altogether. They have no priorists, as most of the houses that are organized do so in a sense of confederation. They're brought into a broader Augustinian family, but most of them are kind of governed independently. The Order of St. Augustine continues to share a special relationship with them, usually acting as chaplains and some sense of spiritual direction, but they're largely independent. Famously, the Augustinian nuns would produce some significant figures, like Clare of Montefalco, or anyone who's been to South Philadelphia is probably familiar with St. Rita of Cassica, given the large shrine there on South Broad Street. Their original focus is a little bit different. They're continuing in this idea, the mendicant idea of charitable work and care for the poor, but their respective houses are very interested in running things like hospices and hospitals and public kitchens and caring for pilgrims, which in the 13th century are really all the same organization. The idea of hospital and hospice and hotel, they're all derived from the same French root. They become a significant element. And even to this day, the Augustinian order is very involved with the Augustinian nuns. I think famously in California, there was recently the announcing that the Sisters of Nazareth were going to be joining into the broader Augustinian family. But they're a significant element within Augustinianism, but they're a distinctive element from the order itself. When the Augustinians become a formal entity within the Western Church, the effect is fairly electric. So once the order is consolidated, you see rapid expansion taking place not even necessarily within decades, sometimes within a few years. They begin moving out from their original locations in mostly northern and central Italy, and to a certain degree, some sections in Provence in modern France. The Grand Union incorporated all of these different houses, and there was a push to try to be able to create more houses, mostly initially north of the Alps, but you do see Augustinian houses develop within the first decade in places like Paris and Venice and some of the major urban centers of Western Christianity. You do see friaries opening up specifically in urban centers, and they are very heavily welcomed by local monarchs, both for their spiritual merits, but also in enhancing the financial landscape of their domain. A lot of what mendicant orders do would be providing something equivalent to social services. They seem especially eager to be able to open these places up in domains in Germany, which see an explosion of Augustinian houses over the first century. There is a lot of funding for this from local aristocrats who also want to be able to bring these friars into the university systems, which have existed prior to the founding of the order. But Augustinian thought is particularly drawn to the ideas of intellectualism, where this would be significant. Within the first 50 years, we see laid out here in some of these distinctive locations, you see the Augustinian order coming into Germany, coming into places which is now Spain, into kingdoms like Aragon, Castile, Leon, certainly in France, where the order became very popular as well, but also into areas that were considered kind of fringe regions, which is a little bit more complicated, because these are areas that are still relatively new in terms of their incorporation into Latin Christianity. So this initial stage of expansion is relatively explosive. What I think is so surprising about the Augustinians is that the mendicant order movement in general, there's this unbridled success that seems to be encountered moving into the 14th century, which no one seems to be prepared for. Within a century of the Grand Union in 1256, the Augustinian order triples in size, if not more. We can't quite match exactly how fast it's expanding. It's taking up new spaces in European cities, and it's moving with growth into Christian states that are on the fringe of what they call the Latino sphere, those groups that adopt things like the Latin alphabet and are in union with Rome. This is particularly salient in some places like Hungary, which is considered kind of the frontier. At the time, the last pagan nation is usually described in Europe as being Lithuania, who won't convert until the middle of the 14th century. And there are other places like Poland, which again is considered frontier, and also Ireland, which famously has been Christian for almost 1,000 years at this point, but is becoming organized in a radically different way. Their monasteries are centuries old, but they're being brought into what's considered to be a continental system. They're adopting Latin styles of monasticism. Some of these don't really have long-standing traditions of government or urban centers. So in places like Ireland, the mendicant movement would go on to help form some of the significant cities in that nation, which previously never truly had any. Even to this day, you can visit an Irish village, and what is frequently at the center of it is some kind of monastic house. To that point, it's probably also worth noting that there's a direct link between the Augustinians in Ireland and the formation of our community itself at St. Thomas of Villanova. So the Augustinian order will arrive in Ireland shortly after the Grand Union, probably sometime in the late 13th century, although no one's completely clear. And it would continue there until the dissolutions of the monastery, when all the mendicant communities were emptied by Henry VIII. But a large number of groups effectively ignored the order from the English king, like the Cork Augustinians, which continued to operate publicly for the next century, or places like the one pictured here, which is the Adair Augustinian Friary, which was destroyed in the 17th century by the Cromwellian armies. The Augustinians in Ireland would go underground for a little more than 2.5 centuries until the Act of Catholic Emancipation in 1829, and shortly thereafter a few Irish friars went on, like Father Moriarty, who's one of the founders of both Villanova and the Augustinian province. This period directly after the Grand Union sees a shift in the nature and composition of the order. Originally, the Augustinian order was distinctively Italian. All of its major components were Italian. Its prior was Italian. We see the growth of this multi-ethnic group, as we see it with a lot of these mendicant orders that have seen such tremendous popularity. There's actually a little bit of fear on the part of both local rulers and the papacy with the success of some of these mendicant orders and what this could potentially mean for the future. Unlike groups like the Franciscans or the Carmelites, where there was a clear identity that was established from day one, the Augustinian order has to question exactly what is their function. So this is a little bit of a struggle, especially at first, where you have so many different groups that originally have different meanings. How do hermits, which is a group that defines themselves as removing themselves from society, fit in with the idea of mendicantism, which involves going out into the world, going out into cities, and involving themselves with lay people? How Augustinian identity develops is probably a lecture series in and of itself, but it's worth being able to talk about one of its early advocates. So this man is usually referred to as Jordan of Saxony, which is a little confusing because there's also another Jordan of Saxony who's a Dominican. In fact, now that I look at it, I'm fairly certain that is a Dominican robe that he's wearing, so this is probably the wrong picture. But Jordan of Saxony, he's a significant early figure in the formation of Augustinian identity. Since the order is composed of all these different groups, unrelated ideas, there needs to be a central emphasis that would help form the order to be a singular thing. Beyond its association with St. Augustine of Hippo, this is not something that was really formally given in the papal document. The Pope doesn't really give any confines for what this order is going to be beyond some objective questions. So the question that's presented is exactly what does a mendicant order that is dedicated to the thought and interests of St. Augustine mean? This is something that will be worked out further in the 14th century, but Jordan is functioning as an apologist for the order, claiming that while there is not a direct line of continuity between Augustine's community and the modern order, it maintains the same spirit. So the community that Augustine founded at Tagaste, or the one he maintained at Hippo Regius, even though they're not directly related, they're still trying to create the spirit of what Augustine had laid down in terms of things like Christian charity, communal living, and trying to be able to create some sense of the living gospel there. Jordan is not entirely accurate in some of the things that he claims. He also gives this apocryphal story about the origin stemming, the order allegedly coming from a dream that Pope Alexander IV had. That's entirely fictitious. There's no contemporary accounts for this. The reasons for the Grand Union were largely functional, trying to bring these groups together so they can be better organized. As you can imagine, a large institution like the papacy doesn't usually make decisions based upon a whim or something born out of a dream. The Augustinians are also present on the very frontiers of Christianity. In the 13th century, this is a very pivotal period in what's known as the Crusades, with some groups having strong ties to the Holy Land. In 1290, the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem requested that the Augustinians assume the monastic house at Acre, which was previously occupied by a different order, and in turn become the monastic patrons of the Holy Land. And this would have taken place, but the Crusader state, namely the Kingdom of Jerusalem, was captured a year following this, and it never came to fruition. And the Franciscans, later in the 14th century, would be given the role as protectors of the Holy Land, which they continue to occupy to this day. However, the Augustinians would be very involved in the excursions into the Eastern Mediterranean. They're going into places within what was then the Venetian Republic, lots of Greek isles, Cyprus, Crete, Corfu, Naxos. They're beginning some of the early stages of ecumenical dialogue with the Greek Church, which at the time is very tense, but it will come to a head later on during more important dialogues like the ones held in the middle of the 15th century at the Council of Florence. So I'd mentioned that there was some concern with the very popularity of mendicantism taking place at the period. By the mid-13th century, the church saw this rapid proliferation of new religious movements, some that are familiar to us, some which have fallen by the wayside, including groups of hermits and mendicant-style communities. Some groups were irregular or unrelated, preaching and begging without any formal papal approval. And the papacy and subsequent councils were concerned about this kind of order and the question of orthodoxy. The authority of existing mendicant orders was in place, but they didn't want this to continue on. It would cause too many disruptions to society. So at the Second Council of Lyon, the Pope and several crucial bishops met, and they stated that there were going to be no new mendicant orders, and they weren't going to be established without papal permission. The challenge to this is that all orders that were established before the year 1215, when Pope Innocent gave his blessing, were to be suppressed. I know there's been a lot of questions on exactly when the Augustinians claim to originate from, and this is why this is important. The foundation of the order is tied directly to the pertinency of whether it can be considered a valid order at this time. So for some groups, trying to be able to declare exactly when their foundation is laid is important. For the Franciscans, who were founded in 1209, that's not a problem. The Dominicans were able to skirt this a little bit. And the Carmelites, because there's no clear founding for the Carmelites, this was a bit of a challenge. They're just founded by someone who's known only to history as B. The claim put forward by some of the order's protector, the Augustinian Order's protector, was that the order did exist before the year 1215, because naturally it was founded by Augustine. Despite the dubiousness of this claim, the Augustinians were able to avoid some of the suppression that was taking place with mendicant orders at the time, mostly because they were able to prove that they had a lot of utility to the church. They were bringing people in, they were loyal to the papacy, and they were helping to establish the good of the church and the care for the poor in a lot of the urban centers that were developing in Western Europe. What the papacy really wanted to see take place was that there was a clear sense of uniformity. Getting papal sanction meant that there would need to be uniformity across the order in at least a few capacities. So this would include things like having the Pope appoint a prior general, having provincial supervisors, maintaining a consistent habit, and setting rules that would be firmly established for all of the communities uniformly across the order. They can't have these separate groups of different hermits doing different things. Focal to this would mean that they would need to standardize education throughout the order in something known as the studia, and it wanted to ensure that all friars would be able to become proper, orthodox, and fully Catholic teachers and preachers, and abide by obvious orthodox principles in some of their teaching and philosophy. So what this would mean would be the establishment of the Augustinian Order through the university system, that all friars who were going to be entering into the order would have courses in theology and philosophy and canon law. And this would have two significant effects. First, there would be an intellectual cohesion in the order. All friars coming into it would have the same kind of experience, and there would be a centered sense of philosophy for what the order is. But it would also mark a significant relationship between the universities and the newly centralized Augustinian order. The Augustinians suddenly become very interested in the life of the university. When this initially happened, the figure of Giles of Rome would be the man who would set the curriculum for the order, who's looking to be able to do a few things. He wants to be able to make sure that Augustinian thought is brought to the forefront. Obviously, as the Augustinian Order, this is significant. But he also wanted to incorporate works like by the philosopher Aristotle, who had recently been rediscovered in the West, and try to be able to incorporate these ideas together in addition to other church fathers and Platonism. This would lay the foundation for what later become known as scholasticism. And it would be a significant element developed in the medieval world, which the Augustinians certainly fully participated in. Because the order came from multiple hermit groups, there was some initial variation in the Augustinian habit, but the papacy standardized the black habit fairly quickly. In the late medieval period, the habit would be more regulated and recognized. One of the elements from the habit that would continue from the medieval period to the current day, and the names associated with the medieval orders. So you can see here in this illustration on the far left, you see the friar who has what they call the Roman tonsure. That's where the center of your head is shaved. That is not a common practice anymore, but it was certainly considered common practice during the height of the medieval era. But the color of the different robes of different orders became significant. So famously, groups like the Carmelites would become known as white friars for their white robes. And the Dominicans would be known as black friars for their black robes. And the Franciscans are usually referred to as gray friars, although sometimes brown friars, depending upon it. This leaves the Augustinians, who by chance also wore black. They gained the name the Austin Friars, which is a term that is still with us. It's not exactly clear where this comes from in the English-speaking world. It's either a medieval abridgment of a name, so Augustine to Austin, in the same sense that you see in early English, Johannes into John. But you also see the influence of Spanish friars who are coming in, where Augustine's name is rendered in Spanish as Agustin. So there's some debate exactly what the origin of this term is. But these separate divisions, by about the end of the 14th century, become very well known. They become almost part of the pop culture of the late 14th century. So I think that should probably close things out for tonight. The next month will be the concluding section of the series where we talk about the Augustinian order during its medieval zenith, things like what the Augustinian influence in the universities are in particular, and how it penetrates seemingly all elements of medieval society, leading right into the early 16th century.
Thank you, Dr. Curtin. This is great. Two things for everyone that's on now. One is we have one more session left on the history of the order. We hope to follow this series the month after next, which would be June, with a series on Augustinian spirituality. So stay tuned for that. But Dr. Curtin, I have two questions, I guess, and I think they're interrelated. The first is just given how the order came together, how did they settle on the name Augustinians? And then the second is, as you kind of put out there, the other mendicant orders really adopted a charism which was personified by the founder, right? So the Dominicans are the orders of is the order of preacher, because Dominic was a diocesan, as I understand, was a diocesan priest who just got out there and started to preach the gospel in an organized way. The Franciscans, simplicity. The Benedictines, stability. But all these are tied to the example of the founder, but the Augustinians didn't have a founder in that regard. So how did we come up with the name that we use today? And how, in your mind, did the charism that we express today come into existence?
It's a good question. I think specifically, there's no point where someone just sat down and decided that Augustine was going to be the central focus point of this new order. There is a certain sense of almost the miscellaneous. So, like the Franciscans and the Dominicans and the Carmelites were all put together for a specific reason because of the vision of the founder. With the Augustinians, it's almost inverted to that. They collected all of these different various groups together and then elected that Augustine was going to be the spiritual founder of it and the directive for it. And there's good reason for that. In terms of the most dominant figures in like the Catholic Church, you really couldn't do better than Augustine. Trying to be able to focus them, there's almost a sense where putting Augustine as the spiritual founder of the Augustinian order gave them some sense of focus. Augustine, unlike most of his contemporaries, even within amongst other mendicants, was very much an intellectual. Francis, in his care for the poor, did a lot to be able to address a lot of the things that we would associate with the mendicants in terms of their service for addressing poverty in the Western world. But Augustine wanted to be able to address the life of the mind. So the Augustinians, and especially when they were brought together and Giles of Rome creates this canon to be able to address it, really want to be able to emphasize this. So how do you incorporate Augustine's intellectual vision of the church, where things can be discussed and thought out, and we can understand some of his vision of change and grace, and bring that together with a broader intellectual tradition of the West? The Western universities are already kind of experimenting with this, but it's really Augustinian thought that will be brought forward to form something like scholasticism, where we have the merger of Christianity and the classical traditions of ancient Greece and Rome. It's almost by pure happenstance that this happened, though. There was no real intended vision to create something that would be distinctively Augustinian in that sense. It was more they created the order with Augustinian spirituality, and the intellectual tradition of Augustine kind of came out of that.
Thank you. Other questions for Dr. Curtin? You can use the chat function, or candidly, you can probably just unmute yourself and shout it out. We should be able to manage that. There we go, Rosemary. Are there any, hold on a second, let me dig this up here. Sorry. Are there any Augustinian hermits today?
So technically, the official name of the order is the Brothers of the Hermits of the Order of St. Augustine.
Yeah.
So they're all technically hermits. But if you go to Italy, you can go back to the original medieval hermitages that were the foundations for the Augustinian order. I don't know if they're accessible to the public in the sense that you can go in them because they're several centuries old, but the hermitages do still exist.
Yeah, I would also point out that as much as I can, I try and live my life. So, maybe right here, as best I can within my current walk of life. Other questions?
Would Augustine's work, the Confessions, have been widely read in the time of the 12th and 13th century?
Great question.
So did that have any impact in bringing together potential friars?
Well, yeah. So when the order is consolidated, there's a question of what should be the standard education for friars coming into the order. So naturally, there are certain things that relate to like broader philosophy and what the church law is, but the works of Augustine come to the forefront of that. One of which is something like Confessions, which even to this day is relatively standard reading for anyone going into the Augustinian formation or even going to an Augustinian university. I know as a student at Villanova, as an undergraduate, I read it multiple times. But they would also incorporated other important texts of St. Augustine. City of God is a large text which would have been studied, but probably selectively. The other big one is probably this one, De Doctrina Christiana, on Christian teaching, which was significant because ultimately the function, especially the original function of Augustinian friars, is to be teachers, to be preachers, to go out and be teaching the gospel so that people can understand it.
De Trinitas as well.
De Trinitas, yes, that's also a significant title, on the Trinity.
Yes. That's a great question, Ed. Thank you. Other questions for Dr. Curtin?
Any sense of the size, the number of absolute friars after the Grand Union, and how that compared to the other, orders of the time?
I'm trying to get at size. So, working with medieval documents, they're extremely fickle because you can't get a good sense of exactly what's going on. You might have one monastery that is great. They keep all of their documents, all of their records. You can tell exactly what happened on a random Tuesday, and other monasteries that tell you nothing. So there's no way we can make estimates, but even knowing that some of the monasteries existed sometimes is a challenge. The closer we get to the modern world, the more documents we have and survive, and there's more of a sense of standardization.
All right, thank you.
Other questions?
Is there someone that you could put alongside Augustine as St. Bonaventure was to St. Francis? And I've read The Imitation of Christ over and over and over, and I read online, if there's any truth, that he was an Augustinian friar in Germany. Thomas à Kempis.
Thomas Kempis, yeah. I don't know much about Thomas Kempis specifically. I do know that during the height of the high medieval period, Augustinianism was very popular in Germany, where there was this explosion of universities taking place. So much so that eventually in 1517, it's going to be Martin Luther, the Augustinian friar, who commences the Protestant Reformation. To address your question, Francis's analogous relationship with Bonaventure. Mm-hmm. Are you asking if Augustine has someone equivalent to that, or?
Yes.
So in the Confessions, Augustine talks significantly about Saint Ambrose,
right,
who is the primary figure for him being able to reconcile his intellectual pursuits with being able to read the Christian scriptures. Mm-hmm. And Ambrose provides Augustine with the key, the idea of the allegorical reading of scriptures. It's not about just reading the text flatly, but there's a secondary meaning that's applied to it. And for Augustine, that opens up the door that suddenly the scriptures become a little bit more vivid because he can understand God's word and the life of the mind intellectually through Ambrose. That's the catalyst for being able to create kind of Augustinian thought, at least as it initially applies to Augustine's own work.
Thank you.
Okay, we are closing in on the top of the hour, and Dr. Curtin, thank you. These have been great. Just from my own perspective, I've been working really closely with the Augustinians now for several years, and I continue to learn things through these discussions. So thank you so much. And for everybody that has joined, thank you as well. And my ask of all of us on this Zoom is that we contemplate what we've just heard and figure out how to apply it as we all go forward. So the past, I think, is only relevant to the extent that it informs the future. So we learned a lot about how this order came together. We all, through the various happenstances in our life, have found ourselves part of the Augustinian family, and therefore we have some responsibility for the future of the Augustinian family. And And so, maybe as we progress from this week into the final session next week, we can just think about that, so that as we wrap this up, we really understand, what we can do to ensure this order's around for another 1,000 years, based on our small contributions today. So with that, thank you again, Dr. Curtin. Thank you all for joining. God bless you and have a good night.